Welcome to The Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully. This is a podcast to elevate teacher voice. In this program, you will hear teachers sharing their journey into this profession and their ideas for education. I'm kicking it off Teacher Appreciation Week, which starts May 2nd. This is about honest, vulnerable, inspiring storytelling. It's a time and a space for teachers to share their ideas for the future of education. Teachers are beautiful beings who give their heart and soul to their community. They're innovators, they're inspirational, not only to children, but to the people around them. And they deserve to share their voice. So welcome to The Teacher's Story. Enjoy. Hi, welcome to The Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully, and today we have Lauren Lumm with us, and she is a former teacher. She's worked in the New York City school district, in Brooklyn specifically, and then she moved to Maine, and she's worked in a school district in Maine as well. She is currently looking to get into DEI work, training, facilitator. She's also starting to work for a program called OutSchool, and she's just really excited to kind of explore what new possibilities could be on the horizon for her in her career. So welcome, Lauren.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. The last time we talked, I just was so excited to have Lauren on the show because her passion for, where education should go and really looking at real social justice in education, amplifying all voices, like DEI work in schools. And that's what we want to be seeing, moving forward. So I was just really excited to have you on. My first question for you is, what inspired you to get into education? Anything from your younger years, or was it later on in life?
So one thing that stands out for me is a moment when I realized I had been lied to by adults around me and by the history books and the narrative that was out there. I had an amazing history teacher in high school, Mr. Leisler, and we studied the Harlem Renaissance. And he took us, I grew up in the Metro New York area, and he took us to Harlem for a walking tour, like a historical walking tour to see, where all of these historical sites were and the famous photographs that have been taken. And all I had heard about Harlem prior to that was, don't go there. It is a super dangerous place. If you're stuck on the train, don't get off the train at 125th Street, go to Grand Central, because, if you are in Harlem, you will be like instantly murdered or something along those lines.
Wow.
And here we were walking around like a vibrant, friendly, thriving African-American neighborhood where, it was just like any other neighborhood, except the people had darker skin, and it was rich with history and culture and great food. And I never felt unsafe. Of course, I was with a whole group of people, but that inspired me. And that led me to, I went to college, I studied history, I concentrated in intellectual history at University of Pennsylvania. So I'm reading a lot of, old white guys. And I picked up African-American studies as a minor and fell in love with W.B. Du Bois, who I had learned about in the Harlem Renaissance. And he talked about going into the Reconstruction era South and teaching kids who had nothing, but he could give them knowledge and he could give them truth. And that, I guess I had a bit of like white savior complex back then, but I felt like, well, this is something I want to do. I want to be an advocate for the truth. And so today, we're not afraid of going into Harlem. Harlem's actually like super gentrified now, but we're afraid of indoctrination and we're afraid of facing what's true in our history that is difficult and often painful and often uncomfortable. And, we see a lot of resistance to that out there, where laws are getting passed, don't discuss anything that might make people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like, well, what is that? Learning is uncomfortable because you're, when you learn something, you're correcting errors and making new connections in your brain. And that's how it happens. So you have to be comfortable with discomfort sometimes.
Absolutely. And there's so many parts there that I just want to highlight, starting with that teacher. I love that. And kudos to history teachers that really get their students out there to, look at the communities around them. I had a guest on early back that was from my prior school, and she would do the same thing. Like, we were in Wilmington, Delaware, and many of the students are like, I don't really know much about Wilmington, even though our school was right there. Yeah. And so you got to get out in the communities, because you hear what people say, and often it's not true. And when you go out and you see these thriving, beautiful cultural communities, then you really can learn something new and have a new perspective. And then it also inspires you, not only maybe now I want to maybe become a teacher because this teacher really inspired me, but also I want to go out and discover the real truth on my own and not just listen to what people are saying. So that lesson, that field trip, is so impactful for young people. And I would love to do that more in my own classroom, and just love to see that more in schools across the country. That's great that you had this kind of like awakening too at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's like right in our area. I'm in the Philadelphia area.
Oh, cool.
Wonderful school. But yes, W.E. Du Bois is amazing. And I think just when you are genuinely just reading primary source documents from the different voices, not just like you said, the voices of like old white men who were in power for a long time, but from all of these different, perspectives, then you really like learn true history, and it kind of open you up to really want to explore, like, how do we bring those truths to the classroom? And I think you were a little bit ahead of the game, because that is kind of like what is just starting now. Like, in a lot of places, like a lot of schools now, like you said, are kind of wrestling with that. Like, oh, wait, we're going to teach the real truth. Like, that's going to be difficult, or that's going to be controversial. I don't know why truth is controversial, but it is. And you were already starting that like early on. So kind of leading into my next question, what were some of your early teaching experiences like when you were in New York City?
So I started teaching in 2005, February 1st, 2005. I was a mid-year teacher.
I started 2005 as well.
Oh, I was in the New York City Teaching Fellows Program. Okay. And so we were placed in schools that were very under-resourced, that had high teacher turnover, that had usually inexperienced, brand new principals. And I, started mid-year with a class that had substitute teachers, for most of the school year. And what I remember most was actually my second year, when I started teaching fourth grade class, and went through most of the year with like no books or resources really, except very, very like old, falling apart Basil readers, no literature in my classroom, everything, everything was just outdated and old and felt old and, felt falling apart. And how do you help kids feel enthusiastic for learning when, they open a book and the spine falls off? And the first new thing we ever got in our classroom, and the only new thing we ever got, were test prep books.
Of course.
And not even, test prep where you're learning it's pure testing skills. Like, this is how you eliminate choices and multiple choice. And this is how you look for keywords, and not even authentic learning, not authentic reading. But, if we can pass the test, it doesn't matter. And that was very eye-opening for me. So I became a bit of an activist in New York City. I was lucky enough to find a position at, I call it a unicorn school, because they're so hard to find, it seems. I mean, a very, very like progressive oriented public school in Brooklyn where, the leadership was strong and experienced, teachers were trusted and revered, and we were given any resource we needed. You look at the other side of that was we had those opportunities because we were in an affluent neighborhood and our PTA raised $1 million a year.
Wow.
And, you have these structural inequalities that are the reason why my school in Harlem couldn't get any books. But my school in Brooklyn had a musical theater program because the PTA was able to bring in a teaching artist. So we had this very like experiential, hands-on, project-based. The culture was very child-centered and progressive. Teachers went by their first names and we didn't give grades, and it was very growth-oriented, and everyone, like we all felt like we were on the same side. We used thematic units, very civil rights, social justice based. And I loved it. I did my best teaching there. And I also was able to do a lot of advocacy because I had that support where I never felt like my voice was stifled. So I worked with the social justice caucus of the teachers union. I ran for office. I went down to Washington, D.C. for Save Our Schools and Occupy the DOE with letters from my students about how they felt about test prep. And we did art projects where they made paper mache masks out of test prep materials and wrote poems about it. And we did a photography project. I even felt comfortable talking to the media about these issues. I submitted testimony to, when the state education chancellor did his tour, I went and I spoke, and I was not ever afraid to use my voice. And that was something that I didn't realize at the time how rare that was for a teacher, because my experience, so I moved to Maine, and I made a conscious choice to downplay that. I got married and I changed my name, and my old name, my maiden name, was I had done all my activist work as Lauren Cohen, which is a very common Jewish name. It's kind of ungoogleable, I've found. Like, you can't really. So I covered up that part of myself so that I could be more palatable to a less sort of liberal bubble population than what I was in.
Before you move on, can I just hit on some things that you're talking about?
Sure.
Wow. So I didn't even have all of this information from the first time we met about all of this activism that you did. And I just want to applaud you for that, especially being a new teacher, and to use your voice in that way and to see, the disparities, right? Like you got that experience of working in a school in Harlem and seeing books that were super old and falling apart and everything was about testing. I had a similar experience when I taught in Hawaii. It was the same thing. I opened up the closets and all the books were old, and we spent so much time prepping for the state test. It felt like weeks, like in the spring, and everything revolved around test scores. And it just felt like it took away the purity of like, what are we doing here? And then you went to this school, an affluent school, raising $1 million from the PTA, but it had all these resources, and you got to really, become this advocate. And I think when it's kind of like the position I'm in now, like when you are in a very secure setting where you feel very safe sharing your voice, and you're in a place where you can create and experiment, I feel like I kind of have that in my position now, and coming out of COVID, I think there'll be more opportunities for that. then you feel like you're like, I can do more, and I know what's not working in other schools, or I know there's many teachers that don't have a voice. And you're right, it is rare. It is very rare for teachers to have a space to actually say what they want to say. Because another thing is too, education is politics. Politics is part of education. And teachers often find, and schools will also kind of be putting that pressure on them of like, you can't just say whatever, right? Yeah. You can't just speak your mind.
Right. You have to be neutral.
You have to be neutral. And of course, like being a history teacher, there's certain stances depending on the issue. If it's a human rights issue, I'm going to obviously going to back human rights and give you that opinion, and there's other political stances where I might be more neutral and also want to play kind of devil's advocate and hear different sides from students. But if you're really passionate about something, particularly in education, and this is like kind of your life, like mission, like, yeah, we should be able to go out there and say what we want to say. And I love that you went to DC and you talked to the media and you had all of this experience to really be, and to share both sides of like, I see where schools are really lacking resources and it's really, they have these disparities. And then I could see these beautiful schools that are thriving and these students are getting everything they need and more. And that's a problem. I mean, that's a problem in our country. And these are public schools, right? Like public education it's a social program. And it was meant to be like anything. It was meant to be equal, but it's so different from town to town, city to city, state to state. And I mean, I've had students tell me in my own class, like we have Camden scholars from Camden, New Jersey, and they will tell me how different it is. Like their friends going to school in Camden, and then they had the opportunity to get a scholarship for our school. I mean, I had a student write a whole research paper about it last year, how different it is. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before you move on, because now you're sharing how it is now you're moving to Maine and it was very different. Yes. So this is kind of like that, beginning of that transition, right?
Yeah. But something you made me think about was even, just how powerful test scores can be. I mean, when I got the job at that unicorn school in Brooklyn, the reason that there was a job for me was in part because of test scores, because test scores were so focused on growth and like the student has to grow from this year to the next year. And this district where the school was located had middle school choice and a middle school application. And so those fourth grade test scores were incredibly important because those were the ones that counted for middle school. So parents in this affluent neighborhood would do everything to get their kids' fourth grade test scores up, and the fifth grade test scores would not show the growth. And and I got hired the year after the teachers' growth ratings had been published in the newspaper. I mean, the fifth grade teachers, were in this position where they looked like they tanked, but really it was because of this artificial inflation that had happened. And really, you can't compare growth on two different tests. It's apples and oranges. Anyway, there's so much data out there that's like bad data anyway. But I just had to say that. So Maine, I did my research, found out which school districts in the area were all about the test scores and which school district in the area was more child-centered. And I went to the child-centered one. Leadership has changed over. It's become much more focused on test scores and on teacher uniformity and addressing inequities by putting them on the individual teacher rather than looking at like what is in place on a systemic level. And, one good example of that was we have two middle schools in our district. One middle school is on the campus of the high school. The kids at that middle school have a late bus every single day for after school programs. They're able to regularly visit the high school. Kids who are accelerated can even take classes there. The other middle school is 10 miles down the road. and they don't have the same resources.
Wow.
And to look at that situation, and the administration draws the conclusion, well, the problem is that the teachers at the school down the road aren't teaching the same thing and have lower standards, and we need to make sure that there's uniformity because that's how we have equity.
Mm-hmm.
So that
in one district, so different.
In one, yeah.
Wow.
District.
Yeah. I just don't understand this like sense of like, if everything's uniform and it wasn't uniform. Those were two different situations with those middle schools, but that doesn't make that equitable, right?
Right.
It's like when we talk about equity, so when we get into like DEI and everything, equity is about, you need to see what children or anyone really needs to be able to be fully supported and to excel, right? You don't just like say it's going to be the same everywhere, because there could be places where they need more resources. So that's like where you really want to see equity happening. But it's just so bizarre how different it was in just one school district.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's so much going on here.
Yeah. So what were you there teaching during the pandemic? I kind of use that too as like another question. Like, what was that like? Or was that kind of like the time period of where you're thinking like maybe this was time to transition out of the classroom?
So I would say teaching during the pandemic kind of re-radicalized me back into activist mode.
Okay.
Because I mean, for one thing, I was teaching 6th grade, and my school district insisted on keeping their grading policy intact during the initial spring 2020 closures, upheaval. Where a lot of our district is very rural, kids don't always have access. I mean, and we're supposed to keep grading them as if things are normal. And I just couldn't. I was I already coming from a progressive school. I already had trouble adjusting to giving A through F grades and treating feedback as, always like a measure of, like progress against rather than like looking at individual student progress and growth, sort of an arbitrary, like single measure score that you have to reach.
Yeah.
That was always something that I struggled with. Because I feel like grading is a whole thing, where you're grading compliance, or more so than you're grading learning. But so what I ended up doing was giving everybody A's or A minuses or A pluses, depending, if they deserved a A plus or if they weren't quite there and got an A minus. And that was controversial. Not everybody liked that I did that.
And this was at the height of the pandemic.
This was at the height of the pandemic, and these were 6th graders. So honestly, what do the grades matter anyway? Right. Nobody looks at the 6th grade report card. And I just felt like I couldn't punish kids for not having access. And I taught the fully remote 5th grade program for the following year, and I made it work. I loved, the autonomy of having kind of my own separate program, because there was in this district like this push for uniformity across classrooms and data up the wazoo. And because my situation was different, I could kind of do things a little bit differently. And I did a lot of flipped learning. I really worked hard on building community, and we had very limited, like our district said that they didn't want kids to be on their screens for more than 2 hours a day. So I made the conscious effort to devote some of that limited face time to community building and to social activities for the kids because they were fifth graders. And I felt like this was extremely important. And I really thought that the students thrived. And it sort of pained me to go back and see people dismiss remote learning as, I even had colleagues say to me, like, oh, he didn't learn anything last year. He was fully remote. And I'm like, I was
heard that a lot.
I was his teacher last year. What are you saying? I know that kid learned. And it looked different. And, you know, something we should learn from the pandemic is that people need to feel heard. They need to feel safe. They need to feel like they matter. And returning to the classroom last year and the return to the status quo was so jarring. And it's like, well, now we're supposed to just go back to doing everything the way it was before, but even more so because learning loss. And so we, you know, the school eliminated the extracurricular time during the day that had been used for like recess for some, sort of lunchtime sports, recess for some kids, and club meetings, and everything was like academic time. Everything has to be academic.
Wow, that was last year.
That was last year. And meanwhile, student behavior is going off the charts.
Of course. They need that social activity.
Yeah. And they've been through a collective trauma. And even, you know, they've also been through a year where even the ones who were in school in person couldn't do group work the way, you know, a classroom would have kids collaborate. It all had to be like, they all had to be isolated at their own little desks. And me, you know, I had come off an entire year of like using my calming, like NPR host voice to talk to children on the internet. And, you know, even just trying to command attention in a classroom was so difficult for me. And I felt like, you know, it was my 17th year and I felt like it's my first year again. And the burnout that was when the burnout really.
Yeah, I talked about that too. So many things. So you were remote was it the whole school year of 2020 to 2021?
Yeah.
And I know there's quite a few teachers, not so much in my tri-state area, like New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, even like New York, but like I know quite a few people across the country where they were remote almost the whole entire year or the whole year. And I mean, most of my students were too. Like we did hybrid that year, but I had more than 50% of my students that were at home almost the whole year. And the adjustment of the following school year, and I said this, and this is what kind of like kicked me into thinking about like wanting to share my story and then interviewing teachers. I thought last year it was harder, even though hybrid was so hard.
Yeah.
Because there was the beauty, there are beautiful moments during virtual learning and during the pandemic. There was so much sense of we need to be there for each other and we care about each other. Yeah. I mean, I saw more vulnerability, and I even had moments where I cried with my students during all the things that were happening in our country, especially talking about it in a history class. And there was just this like real human connection, and everyone just learned so much more, not content necessarily, or again, testing. They learned how to be part of a community, how to care for each other, how to think deeply about the, you know, injustices in our country, in our world, about our future, and have deep conversations. Like, and I mean, probably even at the middle school level, I'm sure. And then we came back to the school year last year, and we were all back in person. There wasn't hybrid, but you could go online if you had to isolate for COVID. But it was basically almost back to normal. And initially it felt like all of that went out the window. Like we didn't know how to like come back to that sense of community again. I mean, we physically could do
activities, but it just was like, I can't go back to what we were doing before. We can't have gone through 2 years of this like dramatic change that was so difficult, but so many wonderful things came out of it. And then just go back to 2019. Like it just can't. And if you try to force that or also add on more academics and like ignore all the important like social development aspects of school, it's like, we're just going to ruin the system. I mean, and I feel like that's where a lot of teachers are very frustrated if they are in schools where that was happening, or they felt that there was very little support. And then we all had an awakening too, as teachers, of like, what's really important in education: community, mental health, being a good human being, like community service, serving others, obviously academics, but do we have to have all of these courses and check off all of this on your transcript? Grades, like rightly said, like it was the height of the pandemic. Why did grades matter in 6th grade? Like we had, just for the spring of 2020, we said grades were optional as far as like, you can get your grade up to 3rd quarter. 4th quarter basically is like, if you do well and you wanted to add it into your GPA, great. If not, and you really struggled, it's gone. Like, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And I felt like we had to do that because it's like, there were so many issues even at my own school where students had a hard time even connecting to internet, attending class. There were many students and faculty that had sick family members, even lost family members. I had a number of students lose family members, and we're going to worry about grades. Like, that's not important. And like, yeah, there could be a whole other episode, probably even podcast on just grading, because I think that can definitely be transformed. And I would love to see it based just more on, like you said, student growth, individual growth. It's about the process, not the product necessarily. Like, what are you like learning through this whole educational process? Because the idea is like, we want them to be lifelong learners and really be interested in wanting to continue, education and just their own growth and learning. But you can't go back to like how it was, and then also dump more on them. That's where you break people down, and that's kind of where you were at. So if you want to just kind of share a little bit more about this now, kind of this moment of, I'm burnt out, I got to look at something else.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I was thinking about the question of like, what most needs to change in education. And a year ago, I would have said like standardized tests, get rid of the standardized tests, and secondary to that, okay, grading. But now, we have, I think 36 states that have either passed or are looking at legislation to limit the teaching of history.
Yeah.
And that's terrifying.
It is.
And there's an atmosphere where parental entitlement has gotten just so out of control, where, parents or even community members who aren't parents feel like because it's public school and we pay taxes, we get to have a say over the teachers who are the experts in the classroom. And to me, that's not too far off from, well, we're allowed to storm the Capitol because, it's the people's house and the government belongs to us. Like, it's the same sort of entitlement mentality.
Yeah.
And
boundaries are being crossed.
Yes. And what I see is parents co-opting the language of equity and talking about how their children are being discriminated against because they're Christian and they have to see rainbow flags, and you're discriminating against their beliefs in traditional Christianity, or students are being marginalized because they're conservative, because, we want to talk about systemic racism and white privilege as phenomena that exist. And so you see them I've seen this firsthand. I worked on my district's equity and education committee, and what really began to stymie us was the parents who were taking over and co-opting that language and saying they were being discriminated against because they don't want to accept that there's different kinds of families and different kinds of love out there.
Yeah.
And that, it's hard. And I have had parental complaints about me and my teaching, for using materials from Learning for Justice, teaching, which was then teaching tolerance. But, even just using those materials, I had parents go to the school board and say, this is left-wing propaganda. Where's the other side of this? They're affiliated with Southern Poverty Law Center, and that's a political organization. And this teacher is bringing politics into the classroom. And I was teaching ELA and sharing that we were going to read poetry from people who had a lot of different life experiences and people of color and LGBTQ people. And we learn about different voices and we learn to accept them. And that somehow got turned into a rumor that I was teaching the entire year. I would be focusing on human sexuality and LGBTQ identity through poetry. And that was
wow.
Parents and even colleagues of mine participated in spreading this rumor that
oh my goodness,
that was something I planned to do. I don't even know that many poems I don't even know that many poems to teach an entire year on that. But
wow.
So I think seeing that, and that was in 2017, 2018, and now we have this whole groomer language. We had the CRT panic, and now we have teachers being called groomers and pedophiles. And I was a civil rights team leader. We had a gay straight alliance in my middle school that had to disband because we were told we could no longer meet during school hours. And the kids, many of them didn't feel comfortable asking their parents if they could stay after school to go to their gay club because they weren't all comfortable sharing those.
Right, of course. Oh man.
And I realized how much I became incentivized to just play it safe and just avoid any topic that would provoke outrage, because we had parents weaponizing their own children, to report back on teachers, and they were looking for that. And wow. I got to the point where I said, they don't pay me enough to be abused, and to, even when my district said they supported me, they would support me by telling me they supported me, but I still had to take the abuse and be yelled at by parents and have angry emails and have parents talking about me on social media.
Wow.
And I never felt safe. And I had to leave. And I'm sad about it, but at the same time, since I've left, my mental health has improved greatly.
You had to leave.
I had to leave. I definitely made the right choice.
Yeah, Lauren, wow. And I know we talked a little bit about this before, but just all of that. And when you say they don't pay me enough, it doesn't even matter if you get, you're making 6-7 figures. No one should be treated that way. No one should be slandered like that. And to be up on social media, having, bashing a teacher, it's absolutely appalling. And I know this has happened in other places around the country, but this is kind of the first time I've had someone on the show and really just this more intimate view of that, and a person who experienced that kind of, pushback to the level where, it is abusive. It's very abusive. And so I think this conversation is important because I've said this before, the media is going to spin this whole, all these teachers are leaving.
Yeah.
You have to hear these stories, right? There's good teachers leaving and there's good teachers staying in. It depends on their situation. And if I was in your situation and especially the passion you have as a history, humanities teacher. Same with me. And I was being like bashed for teaching truth. And I teach those resources too. I use them too. Yeah. I would be so heartbroken. It's not just like, well, let me leave the school and find another place. Cause it sounds like maybe, I don't know, it's just the area is more of this kind of, type of community and how they respond to this type of curriculum. So I don't know if there is even other schools that you would look at, but I would be so heartbroken and just beaten down that I'm like, I can't put myself back out there again. What if I do go to another school and go to another classroom and I still want to continue to do this good work and it happens again? I will literally be, I'd be in an institution. Like, I can't do this. So you have to, in these circumstances, you have to take care of yourself. And I'm glad that at least as hard as it is, it's a really hard decision because you love what you do. And it's like, it's not the kids. You love the kids, and you want to teach them the truth. And this generation wants to know the truth. They want it. And so you're being pulled in so many directions. And of course you're like, well, I got to do what's right for me. And especially at a moment where I'm like, I'm just so broken. Like, I just have to. And I think now you're in a space where you could talk a little bit about this, about the work you want to get into and what you're looking to get into, that still can make such an impact on, eventually it can be tied to education, but it's impacting communities, right? Like, if you come back into your activism or come into DEI or those kind of roles, like it's still making an impact on society. And it might not just have to be in a classroom, right? It could be in another way, in another, forum. So if you want to talk a little bit about where you're at now, and I'm so happy that you are doing better. Thanks. And thank you for sharing all of that. It's very, very brave of you to share all of that with us.
So in terms of what I want to do when I grow up, it's been more difficult than I expected. Yeah. But I've also found clarity in terms of I'm very much a social justice warrior and a warrior for equity in education. And I'm hoping to work in that DEI field or looking at nonprofits and other organizations where we're improving access and equity for marginalized groups or like restoring democratic practices to education. Yeah. So I started off on this sort of corporate training path, like, oh, I love speaking in front of people. I love teaching. I love facilitating and leading, but, it's that word corporate that